Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about Columbus, because most people, even professors, know very little about Columbus, and very few have read his diary, memos, or his letters. Before I began my research, I too knew hardly anything about the man, except that in 1492, he sailed the ocean blue, and never imagined I would write a book about him. Here's how it began. In the fall of 1999, I was teaching a class at Stanford called Millennial Fever. In order to observe the apocalyptic frenzy that was gripping the United States over the turn of the millennium. People thought planes would fly out of the skies because computers were going to crash and so forth. But the class also explored the history of the religious underpinnings of apocalyptic millennial thought. And in one of the readings, I came across a tiny footnote about Columbus's apocalyptic millennial beliefs. I was stunned. I had never heard anything about them, nor had anybody that I asked, including professors and historians at Stanford. I guess this is not so surprising because more than 20 years ago, theologian scholar Leonard Sweet wrote, and I quote, "Scholars most interested in millennialism have largely ignored Columbus, and those scholars most interested in Columbus have skipped over his millennialism, because to delve into it would mean taking a medieval journey into mysticism, dreams, visions, poetry, monasticism, crusading ideology, prophecies, messianic illusions, apocalypticism, and millennialism. A journey few academics have wished to take. But I was willing to do so since much of my academic work is focused on religion, critically. I started to read some books about Columbus, but quickly became dissatisfied because none of them mentioned his religious beliefs, and certainly not his apocalyptic beliefs. Instead, they seemed to treat him as if he were just like us, and only his clothes and his ships were different. The goal of cultural anthropology is to try to understand people in their cultural context, because that influences how they think and how they act. For example, my own anthropological experience fieldwork was conducted in a small village on top of a mountain in Turkey, where I lived for 2 years in a mud brick hut with no running water or electricity, and just a hole in the ground for a toilet, although it wasn't closed. The people were mostly illiterate farmers and shepherds. It became very clear to me that Islam was not a religion in the way we tend to think of it, as a belief system dealing with the spiritual aspects of our lives. Instead, it was their whole worldview. It provided the very context in which they lived. The same was true for Columbus. He lived in a Christian Catholic world that enveloped his life. The Protestant Reformation had not happened. So for him and his peers, the Catholic religion was the one true and only religion. Anything else was considered a false sect. Although anthropologists generally study living cultures, I thought that if the past is another country, as the saying goes, it seemed reasonable that I could visit Columbus's world. I began to read a lot about 14th and 15th century Europe to get a sense of the world into which he was born. The following will set the stage. Please try to put yourself into his world. First, the universe was very small, and the earth was at the center. The sun, the moon, and the stars revolved around the earth. They also thought that the earth had only 3 parts, Europe, Africa, and Asia, thought to have been peopled by the 3 sons of Noah. More important, Jerusalem was at the center where the 3 parts met. For Catholics, Jerusalem was sacred, not just because it was the place where Jesus preached and was crucified, but also the place where he would return in the last days. It was an outrage that Jerusalem was in Muslim hands. Although a number of crusades had been launched to recapture it, none had succeeded. As a boy, Columbus witnessed a crusade launched from Genoa. Perhaps that's where he first got the idea. Before the end of the world, Jerusalem had to be in Christian hands so the temple could be rebuilt. And that was necessary because it was where Christ would come to judge and believers were raptured to heaven. It was the duty of Christians to evangelize and try to convert non-Christians so they too would be saved. People believed that there were only 7 millennia to the Earth's existence, 1 millennium for each day of creation, and people thought the end was near. Even before he had the idea of his voyage, Columbus had figured out how many years were left. Later, he revised this issue when he wrote his own book of prophecies, and I will get to that a little bit later. Okay, that's enough background for now, but I hope that gives some sense of the world into which Columbus was born in 1451 in or near Genoa. People feared the end was near because of a number of events that had occurred in Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries. A terrible famine and then the bubonic plague took the lives of 25 to 50 million people, and there were still outbreaks of it. There was also a schism in the Catholic Church, where there was one pope in Avignon and a pope in Rome, and the schism was not resolved until the early 15th century. Excuse me. But the capstone to all of these turbulent events was the conquest of Constantinople by Muslims in 1453, 2 years after Columbus was born. This was devastating, especially to the Genoese, because they had a large trading colony there. Many were killed, but some returned home wounded with terrible stories to tell. Muslims were clearly in the ascendant. Now they blocked not only the overland pilgrimage route to Jerusalem, but cut off the trade route to the riches of the East. This route had been established by Franciscans and especially Marco Polo. Columbus's copy of Polo's travels is well annotated and is one of the 9 books from his library that still exist. Marco Polo, as well as the Franciscans, believed that the Grand Khan of Cathay, what we think of as China, was interested in Christianity because he had asked that friars be sent to instruct him and his subjects. Some, like Polo and then Columbus, began to think that perhaps the Grand Khan could be persuaded to launch a crusade from the east as the Europeans marched from the west to recapture Jerusalem. With the overland route to the East Bloc, people thought the only way to get there was to sail around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. That was the path the Portuguese pursued. Columbus had sailed with them a number of times, but he was beginning to think of going west across the ocean because Marco Polo said the landmass of Asia was huge, and thus the ocean separating it from Europe must be quite narrow. Obviously, nobody knew about the American continent in between. Excuse me. While sailing with the Portuguese, Columbus had experienced westerly currents and winds as they passed the Canary Islands, and he thought that would be the place to start a westward crossing. The Portuguese king was not interested, but Columbus did not give up. He sent his brother to England to see if Henry VII might support such a venture while he went to Spain. His wife had died, and now Columbus had his young son Diego in tow. Together they sailed to the port of Palos de Frontera, from where, 7 years later, the first voyage would depart. They arrived sometime in the summer of 1485, climbed up to the Franciscan monastery of La Rábida. Columbus had always been partial to the Franciscans, and his friends noted that he was a passionate man of ardent faith. For example, Bartolomé de las Casas knew Columbus and said this about his faith. He observed the fasts of the church most faithfully, confessed and made communion often, read the canonical offices like a member of a religious order, hated blasphemy and swearing, and was most devoted to Our Lady and St. Francis, and was grateful to God for benefits received, and was especially devoted to the idea that God should deem him worthy of aiding somewhat in recovering the Holy Sepulchre. Columbus and Diego were well received at La Rábida and lived there for several years, while the monks worked on getting him an audience with Queen Isabella. I have visited La Rabida, and the current monks are very proud of their connection to Columbus. They have even preserved several relatively intact rooms where Columbus spent time. Columbus met Isabella in May of 1486. She was clearly taken with him. She too was partial to the Franciscans and was also interested in the recovery of Jerusalem, and her grandfather and uncle had made that pilgrimage. She was quick to agree with Columbus's plan because the Pope had given to Portugal all the land along the coast of Africa and the right to enslave any Muslims or pagans they encountered. That decree is known as Romanus Pontifex. Isabella had to submit Columbus's proposal to a committee for further study. It would be a long wait. During this time, Columbus met Beatriz de Harana. Although the daughter of peasants, she was educated and could read and write, qualities that appealed to Columbus. They soon became a couple, and in 1488, their son Ferdinand was born. In 1490, the commission rejected Columbus's proposal, and so did his second one. He had been waiting for 6 years and thinking about his project for a decade. So he decided to go to France and was already on the road when a confidant of the Queen rushed to find him and brought him back, telling him that Isabella, who had told Isabella that she was losing a great opportunity at little cost. She signed the papers in April 1492 and told the people of Palos to prepare ships for the voyage. As you know, these were the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. I won't go into the details of the immense task involved in getting the ships ready and finding the 87 men to go with him. It is in my book. Before departing, Isabella gave Columbus a letter of friendly greeting to the Grand Khan, if and when they should meet. Once underway, Columbus began to keep a diary, very unusual at the time since not all sailors could write. And even if they did, they only jotted down the wind, the direction, and the speed. At the beginning, Columbus recapitulated his understanding of the voyage. He wrote that he hoped to meet the person who is called the Grand Khan, which means in our Spanish language, King of Kings, to see how their conversion to our holy faith might be undertaken, because so many times he had asked for men learned in our holy faith in order that they might instruct him in it, and how the Holy Father had never provided them, and that so many people were lost, falling into idolatry and accepting false and harmful sects. And you commanded that I should not go to the east by way of land, but by route to the west, by which route we do not know for certain anyone has previously passed. And of course, nobody knew about the American continent. The purpose of the voyage was to set up a trading post to obtain the gold and spices that would finance the crusade. There was absolutely no intention of killing or enslaving the people belonging to the greatest empire in the world. Finally, on August 3rd, 1492, the small fleet shipped away from Palos into the unknown. Columbus was confident and began to think of himself as Christ-bearer, like his namesake, St. Christopher, carrying the Christian faith across the waters. But the men with him were afraid they might run out of food before they reached land, and maybe also run into monstrous races described by Pliny. Their anxiety increased when the rudder of the Pinta came loose on their way to the Canaries. Then there was an eruption of a volcano on a nearby island on Tenerife. Not good omens. But finally they set out on the uncharted ocean, sailing due west because Columbus thought that Chipango, Japan, was at the same latitude as the Canaries. Once they arrived at Japan, China was not far away. Late in September, they got entangled in the Sargasso Sea and saw some birds. So they thought they might be approaching land. But the crew became anxious and demanded that if they did not find land within 3 days, they should turn around before they ran out of food. Amazingly, in the next couple of days, there were more signs that they were getting close. Late at night on October 11, Rodrigo de Triana, on board the Pinta, called out, "Tierra, tierra, land." That night, they sat up in great anticipation. Their vigil was rewarded. Early morning, a veil of mist opened, and Columbus and crew saw an island full of green trees and abounding in springs, with a large lagoon in the middle. Columbus was relieved. He had crossed the ocean no one thought possible, and done so in 33 days, a feat that few sailors in small boats have surpassed, and instinctively chosen the route that such sailors continue to follow. October 12th is the date Columbus wrote in his diary, but he was using the Julian calendar, whereas we use the Gregorian, which was not adopted until 1582. Between the two is a difference of 10 days. So our holiday actually commemorates a day when he was still at sea. Maybe we should change it or call Indigenous Peoples Day October 22nd. The crew scrambled ashore, kissed the ground, and thanked God for their salvation and for bringing them safely across the water. Columbus called it San Salvador for their salvation. Soon a multitude of people hastened to the shore, astounded and marveling at the sight of the ships. Columbus's impulse toward the native people was one of benevolence and friendship, motivated by a concern for their conversion. I quote, "In order that they would be friendly to us, because I recognized that they were a people who would be better freed and converted to our holy faith by love rather than by force, I gave them red caps and glass beads and many other small things in which they took so much pleasure and became so much our friends, it was a marvel. The natives came swimming to the ships and brought us parrots and cotton thread and many other things, and they traded them to us." Then his description of the people, reflecting an almost anthropological attention to detail, comes across as objective, writing what he saw with his own eyes. "All of them go around naked as their mothers bore them. They are very well formed with handsome bodies and good faces. Their hair is coarse, almost like the tail of a horse, and short, except for a little in back, which they wear long. The natives on their side must have been astounded to see such heavily dressed men with beards, since they had very little facial hair. Columbus also marveled at their small, swift boats that he would soon call by the native name canoe. We now know they had arrived in the Bahamas, but Columbus imagined they had landed on one of the many islands described by Marco Polo and was eager to continue and find the land of the Grand Khan. So they continued on, passing islands that were all very green with sweet-smelling breezes. Columbus's eyes pained him, and his descriptions give a sense of the therapeutic value of their beauty. I also walked among those trees, which were more beautiful to see than any other thing that has ever been seen. I do not know where to go first, nor do my eyes grow tired of seeing such beautiful verdure and so different from ours. And the smell of the flowers or trees that came from the land was so good and soft that it was the sweetest thing in the world." He was overwhelmed not only by the beauty of the trees and flowers, but also of the fish and the birds. And he used the word marvel or marvelous too many times to count. He also marveled at the natives' houses, and especially at their hammocks, which would soon solve the sleeping problems of sailors. His poor sailors had slept wherever they could find space on deck. So that was a great gift from the natives. Columbus also understood that they were not speaking gibberish, as so many Europeans attributed to primitive peoples. But it was one language, and he soon began to learn some words, vowing that little by little I will progress in understanding and will have this tongue taught to persons in my household. They headed towards a large island called Cuba, which he thought might be Chipango, Japan, and thus he thought he could soon reach China, because he wrote, I have decided to go to Quinsay and give your highnesses letters to the Grand Khan. Columbus noted how generous the natives were and demanded from his men that there be an exchange of goods. This would become a common refrain, as the sailors were rapacious. But while he had control of them, he said, I did not allow anything to be taken, not even the value of a pin. With gestures, people told him, with words and gestures about some other people, fierce, one-eyed natives with snouts of dogs who ate men, and that as soon as one was taken, they cut his throat, drank his blood, and cut off his genitals. These were called Caribs. In early December, he reached Haiti, which he named Hispaniola. And when the natives came aboard, he ordered that they should be treated courteously because they are the best and most gentle people in the world, and especially because I have much hope that in our Lord, oh dear, whoops, I've lost my place, wait a minute. Especially because I have much hope in our Lord that your highness will make all of them Christians. But he was becoming very annoyed with his sailors when he sent them ashore to explore and compared them unfavorably with the dignity and generosity of the natives. News of his arrival traveled fast, and soon he received an invitation from Guacanagari, chief of another area. On December 24th, they set out in his direction, but they arrived late, so they anchored outside to wait for the night. The person on watch was careless, and before dawn, Columbus felt his ship go aground, and he named the place Navidad because it was born from the Santa Maria. They were unable to save the ship. Now they had only the tiny Nina, as the captain of the Pinta had taken off weeks earlier, hoping he would be the one to find the gold. As soon as Guacanagari saw what had happened, he sent his people to help unload the Santa Maria, and he had their goods safely stored in a couple of houses he had emptied for them. Columbus invited him to dinner on the Nina, but the chief had already ordered a feast for the men where he and Columbus exchanged gifts. Robert Fusson, one translator of Columbus's diary, wrote, Columbus expresses nothing but love and admiration for the Indians. His affection for the young chief Guacanagari and vice versa is one of the most touching stories of love, trust, and understanding between men of different races and cultures to come out of this period of history. Columbus had equally effusive praise for the islanders. I believe that in this world there are no better people or better land. They love their neighbors like themselves. They have the sweetest speech in the world and are gentle and always laughing. To him, they already seemed to be natural Christians, and he hoped that friars would be sent to teach them about the faith so they would become true Christians and thus saved. But more serious things were imminent. With the only tiny Nina, it was clear some men would have to be left behind while he returned to Spain to get a rescue ship. He wrote in his diary that when he returned, he hoped, and I quote, to find a barrel of gold that those left behind would have acquired by exchange, and that they would have found the gold mine and the spicery and those things in such quantity that the sovereigns, before 3 years are over, will undertake to prepare to go conquer the Holy Sepulchre. For thus I urged your highnesses to spend all the profits of this my enterprise on the conquest of Jerusalem. The phrase, for thus I urged, implies that they had already discussed this, his ultimate goal. Columbus told the men who would remain on the Santa to remain that they should strip the Santa Maria and build some lodgings for themselves, and ordered them to do no harm to the people and to respect Chief Guacanagari, to whom they owed so much. Guacanagari held a farewell feast, inviting other chiefs to attend. On January 4th, Columbus said a sad goodbye to the chief and the men who would remain behind. He also took 6 of the natives, one of whom was a relative of the chief, and said that more wanted to come. They were definitely not enslaved. They were not slaves. A lot of people seem to think that Columbus was there to get slaves. That's absolutely ridiculous. On their way, they caught up with Pinzon, who had captured 4 native men and 2 young girls by force. Columbus ordered that they be returned to their homes. Sometime later, they met a very fierce group of natives who attacked them with bows and arrows. These were the Caribs, and the natives on board were clearly afraid of them. Columbus also noticed that their language, hairstyles, and body ornamentation were different, as was their demeanor. And one scholar believes that the most advanced concept Columbus offered was that of a cultural region unified by language and customs, obviously aware that not all the people he was encountering were the same. It's sort of an important observation. It was a stormy, dangerous crossing, but they arrived back at Palos on the Ides of March, 1493, and spent several days at La Rábida to recuperate. News of their return spread rapidly, and they were summoned to Barcelona, where the sovereigns were holding court. Columbus prepared the natives for the long journey, taking every care that they would be comfortable. When they arrived, the sovereigns held a reception in public view. Then it is said that Columbus quietly and modestly related the highlights of his voyage and discoveries and presented the 6 natives to them. A few days later, the natives were baptized, with the king, queen, and Columbus standing as godparents. Columbus's godson became his loyal interpreter and accompanied him on many of his later explorations. At least one remained at court for the rest of his life. The others chose to return home. None of them were enslaved. Despite all the fanfare, Columbus was anxious about the men back in Hispaniola. He had no trouble convincing Isabella to launch a second voyage. She quickly alerted the Pope Alexander VI. As God's emissary in the world, he felt he had the right to bestow on Christians territories that were in the hands of non-Christians. So on May 3rd, 1493, he issued a papal bull called Inter Caetera, acknowledging that since he had given the regions in Africa to the Portuguese, he could now bestow the area newly discovered by Columbus to the Spanish. Wonder why he thought he could do that. I just find it amazing, unbelievable. Although bestowing lands were meant to be about establishing a trade monopoly, basically telling other Europeans to keep off, I think there is a lot of ambiguity. The very next day, realizing it was not clear enough, the Pope issued another, drawing a line from north to south down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The side close to Africa was given to the Portuguese, and the side of the New World was given to Spain. Even that was not enough. A few months later, the Pope issued Ditum Sequidum, which said that by sailing west, one could reach the east and the land of the Indies, and granted the Spanish sovereigns the right to freely take corporal possession of the said island and countries and hold them forever. The Portuguese were outraged and adjustments were made. But nonetheless, we must be astonished that the Pope thought he could divide up the world among European nations. In addition, according to papal policy, anyone who resisted Christianization or committed acts against nature, mainly cannibalism or sodomy, could be enslaved. This is to emphasize that Catholic Christianity is intimately involved in everything that happened in the New World, yet no one seems to be condemning the Church for its role in what happened. Soon Isabella approved another much bigger voyage, 17 ships. There were sailors and settlers, some hidalgos, some also Ponce de Leon, the future discoverer of Florida, and Michel de Cuneo, whose descriptions of the voyage and the settlement survive. Also, there were 3 Franciscans and a Benedictine friar, whose job was to convert the natives, so they did very little. Columbus's brother Diego and the father of Bartolome de las Casas were also aboard. Excuse me. Along the way, they discovered Guadalupe, on which lived some of the fierce Caribs. And they learned that they had captured people from the group Columbus knew, had eaten the men, made the women concubines, and castrated the boys. Columbus rescued as many as he could and took them back to their homes. They also discovered Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, where they encountered more fierce Caribs and their enslaved people. As they approached Guacanagari's village, they saw a shocking sight. Several lifeless bodies were floating in the water. When they landed, they learned that all of the men who had left behind were dead. The friar immediately wanted to revenge and told Columbus to go kill Guacanagari and his people. But Columbus did not believe it was Guacanagari's doing. With his native godson, Columbus went to see Guacanagari and learned, as he imagined, that the men had begun fighting among themselves, that had formed into groups, that went on raiding parties belonging to another chief, had raped the women and stolen things. This was against his orders, and I've seen his written orders. That chief then came and killed them all. The relationship between Columbus and Guacanagari remained steadfast and friendly, but the new settlers blamed Columbus and their relationship deteriorated. He decided it would be better to move on. So they sailed to a place Columbus called La Isabela. There was much work to do. Build houses, storerooms, gardens, etc. But immediately there were problems with the hidalgos. They refused to work and also refused to let Columbus use their horses to haul timber and stone, which put a huge burden on the other settlers. In addition, these men expected that the natives would be their servants. Columbus had heard about a gold mine in a place called Cibao, which he thought might be Sheba of the Bible, and sent some of them to check it out. At the same time, some of the hidalgos returned to Spain with some spices and 26 of the supposed man-eating Caribs, who because of that crime against nature could be enslaved according to papal policy. Nevertheless, Columbus requested that they be treated better than other slaves and be given instruction in the faith, so that at the least they would be able to secure the welfare of their souls. But he also said that if any natives at La Isabela worked for the Spaniards, they should be paid as employees of the crown. He was clearly disappointed with his own men, but eager to go exploring to find the Grand Khan. He put a man named Marguerite in charge and left specific instructions about what to do and treat the natives. But Marguerite and the men were cruel, and without Columbus's knowledge, rounded up a large group and sent them back to Spain with a number of the disaffected hidalgos, who then complained to the sovereigns that Columbus was too strict with them. Meanwhile, Columbus was exploring farther to the west, and when he came to what is now Cuba, he thought it must be the beginning of the mainland, adjacent to the noble region of Cathay. In other words, it was not too far from the Grand Khan. But they had been gone a long time and they were running out of food, so they headed back to La Isabela. On the way, a fleet of elaborately decorated canoes came out to meet them. The chief of that group greeted Columbus, and I quote, "Friend, I have decided to leave my homeland and come with you to Castile and see the king and queen of the world. Columbus wrote, he said this so reasonably, I was wonderstruck, but due to the storm approaching, persuaded them to wait for his next visit. When he got back to La Isabela, he found that his brother Bartholomew had arrived and also learned about what Marguerite had done. Because of the false rumors he had sent about Columbus, was concerned. Isabella was concerned. So in the next shipment of supplies, she requested that he return to discuss the situation. At that time, he felt he could not leave because many of the men were sick, but asked her to send good friars who would learn the language and instruct, not just baptize the natives in the religion. He also requested that they send good miners to work in the mines, which was for Las Casas proof that Columbus never intended to make the natives work in the mines. Finally, in March of 1496, he returned to Spain with more than 200 of the Christians and 30 natives who had been rounded up by Marguerite. Perhaps due to his remorse or as penance for how the natives had been treated in his absence, Columbus donned the coarse brown habit knotted with a cord of a Franciscan friar. He had become a lay monk of the Observantine order, and it is said that he wore this outfit for the rest of his life, and in the end it became his burial shroud. Columbus the monk, hardly the image we would think of the man today. The Indians with him were baptized and thus not enslaved. He petitioned the sovereigns to send another voyage, and this time they authorized the construction of a new settlement, and in clear departure from their earlier idea of a trading post to make grants of land to the settlers. This was their beginning of the imperial designs on the New World. But this also changed their previous promise to Columbus, for whom the trading post was to be under his control and from which he was to receive a certain percentage. Finally, on May 30th, 1498, he set sail on the third voyage. 3 ships would go with him and sail farther south, while 3 others would go straight to Hispaniola. Fortunately, those went off course and landed on the far side of the island where a rebel group under the name of a man named Roldan was holed up. Roldan and the men with him went on rampages, raping and pillaging. All of this was unknown to Columbus, who was sailing along what is now Panama, Venezuela, and the north coast of South America. Along that coast, he thought he was near the terrestrial paradise, i.e. the Garden of Eden, the discovery of which many believed would be a sign that the end time was near. In the meantime, the sovereigns had sent Francis de Bobadilla to the settlement to check on the situation. He was a terrible choice, for he already had a reputation for being harsh and had been sued by the citizens of the towns he had commanded in Spain. Why they ever sent him is just a mystery. When Bobadilla got to La Isabela, he saw that 2 Spaniards had been hung. Columbus had ordered their deaths because those men had done terrible things to the natives, and he wanted to set an example that such behavior would not be tolerated. His job was to go exploring to find the Grand Khan. He thought the men left in charge should follow his instructions, but they did just whatever they pleased and are responsible for the terrible things that occurred. Here, a short digression. I would like to say that as far as we know, Columbus never killed a native, took a native woman, or had a slave. Yet Bartolome de las Casas, who was revered as the defender of the Indians, had slaves, had several encomiendas and that were worked by slaves, and did not begin to change his view about slavery until years after Columbus's death. But then it was only about the indigenous people in the Caribbean, because he suggested that the colonists import blacks from Africa instead. When Columbus finally arrived back at La Isabela, Bobadilla captured him and put him in chains. His brothers were already enchained and on board a ship ready to return to Spain. Columbus knew nothing of this. And when guards came to get him, he feared they were going to behead him. Instead, they were all sent back to Spain, but on different ships. With Columbus out of the way, Bobadilla took up residence in Columbus's house, confiscated all of his belongings, and told his men they could take all the gold and women they wanted. And under his rule, many more natives were killed. Back in Spain, the Queen ordered that the chains be removed and told Columbus she had not ordered his capture and promised to replace Bobadilla. Shortly, she sent Nicholas Ovando with 35 ships and 2,500 colonists and appointed him governor of the lands Columbus had discovered, thus stripping Columbus of that title. While recuperating, Columbus turned his attention to the spiritual matter he considered of the utmost importance, the apocalyptic significance of his discoveries. And he wrote, "Here begins the book, or handbook of sources, statements, and prophecies on the subject of the recuperation of God's holy city and Mount Zion, and on the discovery and evangelization of the islands of the Indies and of all other peoples and nations." This came to be known as his Book of Prophecies. The book, written in Latin, is the most explicit and extensive expression of his quest for the liberation of Jerusalem. It remained unpublished for 400 years. That is, it was not published until 1892, but only a few copies of the Latin version were printed. Another 100 years went by before it was published in any modern language, and the English translation didn't appear until the quincentennial in 1992. Few know about it, and very few have read it. For years, Columbus had been collecting passages from the Bible and other religious sources which showed that the discovery of islands was foretold and a sign of the impending end of the world. For example, God says, "I will set a sign among them, to the islands afar off, to them that have not heard of me and have not seen my glory." Next to this especially important passage, Columbus drew a finger pointing to it, as we would underline or put a post-it on it. While Ovando was lording it over La Isabela, Columbus was allowed to make a fourth voyage, but he had only 4 ships and 135 men. Columbus warned that he should not stop at Hispaniola, the very island he had discovered, and he took his 12-year-old son Ferdinand with him. He made the fastest crossing ever and though he was not supposed to go to Hispaniola, there was a severe hurricane warning. He requested permission to land and warned those returning to Spain with Bobadilla. He was refused permission, and Bobadilla scoffed at the warning. Too bad, because Bobadilla and all his men went down in the storm, but Columbus and his ships rode it out. Columbus sailed past Cuba across the Caribbean to Panama, from which he hoped to return to Hispaniola, but they never made it. Instead, they were shipwrecked on Jamaica. They had no food, but Columbus kept the men on board the ship so they would not go on rapacious errands. Instead, since he knew these natives from a previous stop and had been friendly, they set up a trading exchange. Knowing this could not last, Columbus sent a few men in canoes to try to paddle to Hispaniola to get a rescue ship. When one of the canoes reached land, they heard Ovando was close and went to meet him. There they learned about one of the most horrendous acts committed by Ovando. He had burned or hanged 84 native chiefs and other nobles, along with Anaconda, the chief lady of the island, whom all of the natives obeyed and served. She had actually invited all of those chiefs to welcome Ovando, And that was his response. He committed more atrocities than Bobadilla, yet their names and those of Marguerite and Roldan are forgotten, and instead it is Columbus who is blamed for their terrible deeds. Finally, a rescue ship arrived, and on June 29, 1504, all of the men, as well as teenage Ferdinand, bid farewell to Jamaica. They had been marooned for 1.5 years. Not long after, they returned to Spain. Columbus was ill and very disturbed by what the Spaniards had done. He soon also learned that Isabella had died, and thus he was unable to tell her of the perfidiousness of those sent to govern in his place. King Ferdinand was not interested and reneged on all of the privileges they had bestowed on Columbus before the first voyage. Because Columbus was naturally concerned about his family and the natives he had come to know. He spent the remaining year of his life trying to reclaim some of his rights so they would be provided for. He also left funds to support 4 men of religion to go teach, not just baptize, the natives so they could be saved. But his passion for the conquest of Jerusalem never left him, and he left money in a bank in Genoa for that purpose, stating that when it had multiplied and was sufficient for the venture, the sovereign should undertake it and if they were uninterested, his son Diego should do it. Then on May 20th, 1506, the Feast of the Ascension, according to his sons and friends who were at his bedside, Columbus, with his dying breath, said, "Into thy hands, Lord, I commend my spirit." He was only 56.